Argentina today, it's an okay country. It's not exactly the best country on earth, but it's not the worst in its region. Yet economically, it is pretty lackluster. But would it surprise you to know that Argentina was not once a relatively poor nation, but one of the richest countries on earth? That's right, in the early 1900s, Argentina was the 7th richest country on earth per capita. Today, it is 71st. In 1896, it had a GDP per capita greater than the United States', being the richest New World nation at the time. But today, it is not even the richest in Latin America, behind the nations of Uruguay, Chile, Panama, and Mexico. It was very comparable to a country like Canada, rich, export-based, and growing. In fact, its growth followed very similarly to Canada's, until it didn't around the 1930s. Massive inflation nowadays, around 50% in recent years, has lowered Argentina's GDP per capita today to about $8,500. So what went wrong if Argentina used to be a flourishing rich nation? What caused the Argentine Paradox? Argentina has done one thing amazing. It broke the idea that the geography of a nation will equal how rich the people become. Argentina has one of the best geographies on earth to build a country on top of. Like another great power of the Americas, Argentina was protected by mountains to its west and a massive ocean to its east. The Paraguay, Pilcomayo, and Uruguay rivers also protected it to the north and gave it a navigable watershed to grow crops and ship those crops out of. All of these rivers converge to create the Rio de la Plata, the most important river of the region. Whoever controls the river controls the trade, and the Argentines were the one to inherit the river from the Spanish. The city which sat at the mouth, Buenos Aires, ended up being the most important in Argentina, and it showed. Today, Buenos Aires makes up just over a quarter of the entire population of Argentina, and it's where the Spanish elite came to when moving to Argentina. But inland was where the real money was made. The Pampas region was crazy for agriculture, particularly wheat and beef, and became associated with high-quality food worldwide. Early in its history, it also produced silver, whose Latin name is Argenti, hence the name Argentina. It also doesn't hurt that Argentina's climate is perfect for farming, being temperate, flat, and both hot and cool depending on the season. This makes Argentina have some of the best and biggest patches of farmland worldwide, which gave it and Buenos Aires some leverage over world markets. Its geography certainly blessed the nation, but it could have been the river system and the colonial power who controlled it, who created the first blunder in Argentine development. When you were a New World colony, you had 4 choices of rulers: English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish, and if you wanted to secure the future wealth of your nation, you had better hope it wasn't the Spanish. The Spanish generally created 2 types of inequalities: racial and economic. They had an awful caste system of races which they used to classify native peoples and African slaves to determine where they will work. This problem was nowhere near as severe in Argentina as it was in an area like Mexico or Peru, with massive native empires already established. But the other inequality, economic, the Spanish sure did bring. Instead of bringing poor farmers to build up an economy like the British did, the Spanish brought their elites to boost the colony's initial economy. It was essentially an investment into the colony directly, but it comes with the side effect of a very, very powerful elite controlling most of the land in the country, and in Argentina, the elites, dwelling mostly in Buenos Aires, had control over most of the inland region's farms and mines. The wealth stayed inside of the estates and not given to the hands of the farmers. This gave Buenos Aires control over both the politics and commerce of the entire country and gave the Argentine elite that control. It doesn't help that its politics and commerce were very intertwined. Argentina was a very, very export-based colony, exporting mostly silver and wheat with beef added by the late 1700s, but they couldn't just give it to whoever. The Spanish limited who they could trade with, and generally, they were only allowed to trade with Spain. Well, that's not cool to the Argentine farmers who frankly didn't care if their wheat ended up in Spanish hands. You know who else said that wasn't cool? The United Kingdom. The British had recently lost their major New World colony, the States of America, now united, and they wanted to get those juicy New World products somewhere else. They wanted to trade with Argentina, but Spain wouldn't let them. So, They invaded Argentina, which ended up failing twice. But after the war, the Argentines realized that the Spanish didn't really help them fight the British, it was themselves. So they had a war of independence 3 years later and won. By 1860, the Republic of Argentina was created, but it was not stable. Right after independence, they fought a civil war between the elite centralists and the more rural federalists, where the centralists ended up winning, and another which made the British and French blockade the country, stopping the precious exports Argentina needed. In fact, there was basically just one long civil war until the 1860s, until Argentina federalized, with many rebellions lasting until the 1880s, and it's now when Argentina can finally start to grow. The Generation of 80 was a group of the political elite in Argentina from the 1880s until World War I. They oversaw much of the boom in Argentina's growth and are usually credited with it. They were much more economically liberal than the previous rulers, incentivizing freedom economically and wanted to see their country grow. This included trade liberalization, making it much easier for Argentina to trade with whoever they wanted to trade with. If Argentina already wasn't export-based, it was now heavily export-driven and has been described in this time as a super exporter. Between 1880 and 1905, the Argentine economy grew by 7.5 times, or 850%, making them now the 7th wealthiest nation. During this time, many European immigrants had to make a choice whether they should go to the USA or Argentina, as both were booming, growing nations. Many Italians chose Argentina, being of a similar Latin culture, and along with others, the Argentine population quintupled. In fact, even today, about 2/3 of Argentines have Italian ancestry, more than those with Spanish ancestry. During this time, infrastructure, the railway, and literacy rates all spiked, and it looked like Argentina was going to become the powerhouse of Latin America. It was even 4 times richer than neighboring Brazil at this time. Today, that number is only 1.25 times. It wasn't all fine though. There were some pretty big problems that would bite them later. The first is that Argentina was very slow to industrialize, as most of the money being made was through agricultural exports, and much of those profits went straight to the Buenos Aires elites. Frankly, the elites did not want to industrialize. Second is their investment and foreign investment, which Argentina and Buenos Aires might have got a little too much of. They focused on foreign investment to prop up their exporting industries while neglecting domestic consumption. They needed the Europeans to keep importing their food or else their whole economy would collapse, and that had to happen at some point. The opening of the Panama Canal, making less ships travel around South America visiting Argentina, and the start of World War I in 1914 really slowed down Argentine exports, but it didn't kill the nation. No, that didn't happen until the Great Depression. Argentina was likely one of the hardest hit nations on Earth from the Great Depression, starting in 1929. We can even see on our graph of Canada versus Argentina that when the Great Depression hit Argentina, it started a downfall that it never recovered from. Their wonderful foreign investment and exports to other nations suddenly stopped, when every other nation was focused on keeping themselves alive. Argentina did not have the consumption to keep the economy moving, and not even industry to be self-reliant, so they were stuck in a hard place. The new strategy was to focus on import substitution industrialization, essentially replacing foreign goods with domestic goods, blocking off most imports to focus on industrializing yourself into a stronger domestic economy. This strategy never really worked. The GDP shrunk by 25% in 3 years, and political turmoil and violence were more and more common. People migrated from the country to the cities for more job opportunities, only for the elite to become more powerful and not focus on the development of the country. People were more desperate for any type of change to the country, especially during World War II, when exports slowed even more. The Argentines were becoming poor, and there was a man who promised to fix that. Juan Perrin can be seen as the mascot for why Argentina has fallen so far from richness. Argentina was certainly not the only nation suffering during the Great Depression to World War II, and like most other countries, could have made a recovery after, if it wasn't for Juan Perrin. Juan Perrin was elected in 1946 after a military coup on the promises of more land for the people, higher wages, and Argentine security from foreign powers both militarily and economically. He was an authoritarian type of guy whose political ideology, Peronism, wasn't exactly the most orthodox. Peronism is complicated, but it's kind of like a mix between fascism and socialism. Some things Peronism believes in are no foreign investment or outside assistance, self-reliance, heavy nationalism, cutting exports severely, import substitution, political independence, social justice, in particular feminism, heavy corporatism, and many social programs. He claimed to be a third position to the opposing forces of communism and capitalism at the time, and frankly, there were some successes, like Argentina having the largest middle class, most unionized population, and highest paid workers in Latin America, but for every success there were probably 5 failures. For instance, he was essentially a dictator and slowly nationalized many industries to his rule, limiting their growth. His policies surrounding exports and the self-reliance of Argentina basically killed the nation's largest and only way to make money. And as for these social programs he promised, well, when you get rid of your way to make money, you can't really pay for them. So they just made new money, and then that money became worthless. From 1944 to 1974, inflation averaged 26%, far above the 2% most developed countries aim for. And Perrin's forced redistribution of wealth away from agriculture and into industrialization, trying to protect industry, did not make inflation any better. So by 1950, the average Argentine was about half as rich as the average American. Juan Perrin did lose office to a coup d'etat in 1955, who continued the import substitution industrialization gambit that has clearly worked so well. But he came back. In 1973 he was elected once more, and then died the next year. His wife Isabel Perrin ruled for a short time after him, but she was later exiled to Spain in 1981. The Perrins may have left, but their legacy still remains in the country to this day. When the Perrins left, manufacturing in Argentina was on the decline, perhaps due to the lift of import substitution policies. GDP per capita fell by 20% from 1975 to 1990, and inflation averaged 300% in the same period. The deficits were so high that many foreign investors decided to leave the country outright, and when Argentina could not pay off its massive foreign debt made by the dictatorships, it fell into a huge recession from 1998 to 2002, called the Argentine Great Depression. Skipping over some details, Argentina began to grow again, but inflation was still high and the debts accumulated could not be paid back again. So in 2014, Argentina defaulted on its debt again, and again in 2020. To put it lightly, Argentina is not exactly the most trusted country on the world stage when it comes to keeping your money safe with them, and now Argentina is a relatively poor country which had huge potential to become a massive new world power, but it fumbled the bag, and the Argentines must live with that past. The Argentine Paradox has a couple of key answers. Argentina should have been an export-based rich nation much like Canada, but its failure to find new alternatives after its initial wave of geographical expansion like the US, Canada, and Australia did hurt its ability to bounce back while exports were low. Unlike the English colonies, only a small number of landowners owned huge areas of land, creating a very powerful elite with huge control over the country, concentrating the wealth among themselves. The slow transition to industrialize, along with import substitution industrialization, raised prices and stopped domestic consumption, and the depreciation of their currency due to the huge inflation caused their productivity to fall rapidly. Argentina is the opposite of a success story on the world stage. It was once a rich nation full of opportunity, but is now a mediocre regional power with nothing really going for it.